The snow had been falling since before dawn, and by the time Ethan Hale turned his truck onto the main road into Blackstone Ridge, the whole subdivision looked like something preserved under glass, pristine, ordered, untouched, the kind of place that expected you to wipe your boots before you even thought about walking in. He hadn't been back since the funeral. 6 weeks. 6 weeks of paperwork and condolence casseroles and voicemails he hadn't returned. And now, here he was, a cardboard box of his father's belongings riding shotgun, his breath fogging the inside of the windshield, the heater struggling against a cold that had settled into everything like it intended to stay. He almost missed it at first, the flashing amber light, the bulk of the flatbed truck parked at the curb, the way 2 men in orange vests were moving with the specific, unhurried efficiency of people who believed they had every right to be exactly where they were. It wasn't until he pulled into the driveway that he understood. They were hooking his father's truck to a tow rig, and standing on the frozen lawn clipboard in hand wearing a camel hair coat that probably cost more than the truck they were taking was Victoria Hale, not a relative. Just a woman who happened to share his last name and had spent the better part of a decade making sure everyone in Blackstone Ridge understood that she was the one in charge. She drove the red violation stake into the frozen ground with 3 hard, deliberate strikes of a rubber mallet, and the sound carried in the cold air like something being sentenced. The stake had a laminated notice zip-tied to it, bright red, the kind of color designed to be seen from the street, designed to communicate shame to anyone driving past. Ethan stepped out of his truck with the cardboard box still in his arms, and Victoria turned to look at him with the particular expression of someone who had prepared for this moment and found it satisfying. There was a man with a camera, not a phone, an actual camera with a long lens standing near the mailbox, photographing the truck from multiple angles, as if documenting a crime scene. A HO, a security guard, stood near the front walk, hands clasped, watching. Ethan looked at his father's house, the old blue Chevy being chained to the flatbed, the red stake tilted slightly in the wind, the violation notice flapping against it, and he set the cardboard box down on the hood of his own car, very carefully, the way a man does when he is working to keep his hands steady. "This was my father's house," he said. Victoria adjusted her grip on the clipboard. "The community has rules, Mr. Hale." He looked at her. "He died 6 weeks ago. And that," she said, "is genuinely unfortunate. But the vehicle is unregistered to a current resident, which makes it an unauthorized fixture on association property. The occupancy status of this unit is also under review. There are forms." She said the last 2 words, as if they resolved everything. Ethan looked past her at the 287 homes that stretched up the hillside behind her neat rows of identical roof lines under an identical blanket of snow, every driveway shoveled to the same standard, every mailbox the same shade of dark green. He said nothing. Victoria said, "You don't belong here." And Ethan thought, with the specific quiet clarity that comes to a man in the moment just before everything changes, she has no idea she is standing on my land. He carried the cardboard box inside and set it on the kitchen table. The house smelled the way it always had, old coffee wood smoke, the particular dusty cold of a home that had been closed up through winter. His father had lived here for 31 years. The kitchen still had the same cast-iron stove pushed against the wall, the same yellow curtains his mother had hung in 1994, the same drawer that stuck unless you lifted the handle slightly before you pulled. Ethan sat down in the chair his father had always sat in and looked at the box. Underneath the framed photographs and the old watch and the small Bible with the cracked spine, there was a manila envelope his father's attorney had pressed into his hands at the reading of the will, saying only, "Read this before you do anything." He hadn't read it yet. He read it now. The documents inside were older than he expected. Some of them dated 1992, the paper slightly yellowed at the edges. The typeface, the kind produced by an actual typewriter. The deed was straightforward: 1,300 acres in the hill country of Western Virginia, transferred from his grandfather to his father, recorded at the county clerk's office, clean chain of title going back to 1947. What took longer to understand was the lease. It was 50 pages dense and precise, the language of men who had taken care to say exactly what they meant. In 1992, a development company called Blackstone Ridge Partners, LLC, had approached his father about building a residential subdivision on the land. His father, a man who had never trusted salespeople and had an almost theological suspicion of anyone who offered him something that sounded too good, had refused to sell. What he had agreed to after 18 months of negotiation and 2 different attorneys reviewing the final draft was a ground lease. 50 years. The developer could build, could sell homes, could establish a homeowners association, but they were tenants. The land itself never changed hands. He read it twice, then read it a third time, focusing on Section 7. Section 7.4 was half a page long and written in the kind of plain English that suggested whoever drafted it had specifically wanted there to be no ambiguity. It stated that upon the transfer of ownership of the underlying land, whether by sale, inheritance, or any other lawful means, the new landowner retained the right to renegotiate the annual ground lease payment to reflect current fair market value provided. Written notice was given no fewer than 90 days before the adjustment took effect. The current annual payment, as written into the original lease, was $14,000. $14,000 a year for 1,300 acres of land underneath 287 homes, a clubhouse, 2 tennis courts, a community pool, and a small park with a gazebo that had a plaque on it with Victoria Hale's name. Ethan sat very still for a long moment. Outside the kitchen window, the snow was still falling steady and indifferent, and the red violation stake was just visible at the edge of the driveway, leaning slightly in the wind. He picked up his phone and called his father's attorney, a man named Gerald, who had known his father for 40 years and had the manner of someone who had seen everything twice. "Gerald," Ethan said, "I need you to bring an appraiser." The Blackstone Ridge, HOA, held its winter board meeting on the second Tuesday of every month in the clubhouse on the east side of the development, a building that managed to feel simultaneously too large and too oppressive for its purpose. Fluorescent lights, folding chairs arranged in rows, a dais at the front, where the board members sat behind a long table with name placards, as if this were a municipal hearing and not a meeting about mailbox colors. Ethan had attended one of these meetings once years ago, when his father had dragged him along as a show of solidarity during a dispute about fence heights, and he remembered it as one of the more unpleasant hours of his adult life. He attended this one by himself, arriving early, taking a seat in the back row and watching. Victoria Hale sat at the center of the dais in the way that a person sits when they have arranged the furniture specifically so that all sight lines in the room converge on them. She was dressed as if for a professional photograph blazer, pearl earrings, reading glasses on a chain around her neck. The other board members arranged themselves around her with the careful deference of people who understood that their role was to agree efficiently. The agenda was projected on a screen behind the dais. Item 1, Mailbox Compliance Review. Item 2, Holiday Decoration Guidelines. Item 3, Snow Removal Equipment Placement. Item 4, Delinquent Dues Collection. He watched her work through the items with the methodical precision of someone who has confused administration with governance. A man in a green sweater was informed that his mailbox, recently repainted in a shade of forest green that he had believed was HOA approved, was in fact 2 shades too dark and would need to be corrected within 30 days or face a fine of $50 per day. He held a color swatch card in his hand. He had brought it to the meeting specifically and tried to make the case that the difference was nearly imperceptible under natural light. Victoria informed him that the board's judgment on color compliance was final and that the swatch card was not a recognized reference document under the community standards guidelines. The man sat down. A woman near the front raised her hand to ask whether the holiday wreath on her door, which had been there for 11 years, without comment, was now in violation of the new decoration guidelines Victoria had circulated in November. Victoria explained without particular warmth that the wreath exceeded the approved diameter by 4 inches and would need to be replaced before the December 21st deadline. The woman said she had measured the wreath after receiving the notice and believed the measurement to be 18 inches, which was within the approved range. Victoria said the board had measured it independently and obtained a different result, and that the board's measurement was the operative one. The woman nodded and wrote something in a small notebook, and Ethan noticed that she did not look angry, only tired, the way people look when they have been corrected one too many times to bother protesting anymore. There was also a brief discussion of snow shovel placement. Apparently, 2 residents on the same cul-de-sac had been cited for leaving shovels propped against their garage doors overnight, which Victoria characterized as a visual blight, inconsistent with community standards, and which both residents had evidently contested in writing. and been overruled in writing, and the matter had now arrived at the board level as a formal hearing item, which was its own kind of comment on how thoroughly the apparatus of enforcement had been built out. When the agenda reached delinquent dues collection, Victoria's manner shifted slightly, a tightening around the eyes, a precision of language that made clear this was the item she had been waiting for. 3 households were named. For 2 of them, the motion was a 30-day cure period. For the third, a property on the north end that had fallen 2 quarters behind the motion was to authorize a lien and begin foreclosure proceedings. It passed 4-1, the dissenting vote cast by a board member named Raymond, who looked at the table when he voted and said nothing afterward. Ethan had been watching Raymond throughout the meeting. He was a man of about 60, quiet, with the look of someone who showed up out of obligation and had long since stopped believing the obligation was being honored in good faith. After the formal agenda during the open comment period, Ethan raised his hand. Victoria acknowledged him with the particular look of someone who has not yet decided whether to be dismissive or cautious. He introduced himself, said he was Robert Hale's son, and then asked, in the most conversational tone he could manage, "Can the HOA provide documentation confirming it holds title to the land on which this development sits?" The room went quiet in the specific way that rooms go quiet when something has been said that everyone understands is significant, but no one is yet sure how to respond to. Victoria's expression did not change, but something behind her eyes shifted just a fraction, just enough for a person paying close attention to catch. "The association's legal standing is not a matter for open comment," she said. "I'm just asking a question," Ethan said. She looked at him for another moment and then moved the meeting to adjournment. In the parking lot, with a light snow falling and the temperature dropping fast, Victoria found him at his car. She had not rushed, she had shaken 2 hands and collected her folder and descended the steps at exactly her normal pace, as if the confrontation she was walking toward were an item on an agenda she had already approved. "We have been foreclosing on properties in this community for 12 years, she said. Her voice was very controlled, very level. "We will continue to do so." Ethan looked at her for a moment, the snow settling on his coat, and said, "That may become difficult." He got in his car and drove away. And in his rearview mirror, he could see her standing in the parking lot watching him go, not yet understanding what she was watching. Marcus Bennett had an office in a converted Victorian on the east side of town, the kind of building that communicated through its worn Persian rugs and shelves of actual law books that its occupant had been practicing long enough to have stopped needing to impress anyone. He had been recommended by Gerald as the best real property attorney in the county, and within 10 minutes of meeting him, Ethan understood why. Marcus read the lease the way a surgeon reads an X-ray, not skimming, not translating, but seeing the thing itself, the structure underneath the surface. He set it down after 40 minutes and said Section 7.4 is enforceable. I've seen this clause in agricultural leases from the same era. The language is airtight. He had already called the appraiser before Ethan had left the office. The appraisal took 3 weeks. When it came back, the number was $78,000 annually, the fair market value of a ground lease on 1,300 acres of developed residential land in a desirable hill country community based on comparable transactions in the region current land values and the density of the development sitting on top of it. $78,000 compared to the $14,000 the HOA had been paying since 1992. 5.5 times the existing rate. Marcus prepared the notice. 90 days as required by the lease. Lawful in every respect. While Marcus finalized the paperwork, Ethan did something he had not originally planned to do. He went door to door. He did not announce himself as the landowner. He introduced himself as Robert Hale's son, said he was trying to understand the community his father had lived in, and asked if people had time to talk. Most of them did. What he heard over 3 days of conversations on front porches and at kitchen tables was a consistent and dispiriting story. Fines levied without warning, requests for variance denied without explanation. A man on Ridgecrest Court had been cited for parking a work van in his own driveway on a Saturday, not overnight, not as a permanent situation, but for 4 hours on a Saturday afternoon, while he unloaded equipment for a home improvement project. The fine had been $250. He had paid it because disputing it required a written appeal, a board hearing, and a wait time of 60 days during which the fine continued to accrue. A family on the South Loop had been denied permission to install a wheelchair ramp for a grandmother who had moved in after a stroke on the grounds that the ramp design deviated from the community's architectural guidelines in ways the HOA deemed non-negotiable. They had eventually gotten a variance after 14 months and the involvement of an attorney, and by that time the grandmother had died. The man who told Ethan this story was not bitter about it in any active sense. He had processed it the way people process things that are too late to fix, but there was something in the way he told it that suggested it had rearranged something permanently in how he thought about the place he lived. A woman named Dorothy Simmons, 73 years old, who had lived in her home for 19 years, told him about the winter before how the HOA had placed a lien on her property over an unpaid fine of $220, a fine she had disputed and believed to be an error, and how the lien had escalated into a foreclosure notice that had forced her to liquidate savings she had set aside for medical expenses in order to make the HOA whole before she lost the house. She told him this without drama, with the flat affect of someone reporting a fact about the weather, and Ethan sat at her kitchen table and listened and thought about his father, who had lived 31 years on this land and never once mentioned any of this to him. He wondered sitting there whether his father had known and stayed quiet out of some principle he had never articulated, or whether the fear in the community had been subtle enough that even a man living at the center of it had not fully seen its shape. He left Dorothy Simmons's house with a signed affidavit. He left 16 other houses with signed affidavits. People signed without hesitation. Several of them thanked him, which he found uncomfortable in the specific way you find it uncomfortable when someone thanks you for something you are still in the process of deciding to do. He had driven out to these houses with a legal pad and a pen, and no guarantee that anything would come of the conversations and the trust these people extended to him. Strangers trusting a near stranger with the worst details of how the place they lived had treated them was something he carried carefully. When he returned to Marcus's office that evening, Marcus spread the Treasury reports across the conference table, the HOA's own financial disclosures publicly available under Virginia law, and pointed to a line item that appeared every year, every quarter regular as a heartbeat labeled in the budget as ground lease payment, $14,000 annually. Victoria Hale had been the president of that HOA for 9 years. She had signed every one of those reports. She had known since the day she took office that Blackstone Ridge was built on leased land. She had never told to anyone. The morning the tow truck came back was the 23rd of January, a Tuesday, 5:45 in the morning, the sky still fully dark, and the snow coming down hard enough that the streetlights had halos. Ethan heard it before he saw it, the diesel engine, the clanking of the rigging, and he was at the window in time to watch the flatbed pull up to his father's driveway with its amber lights strobing. He recognized the setup immediately. Same company as before, same procedure, but this time there was something new. Victoria was standing on the sidewalk across the street, and she was filming on her phone, the screen casting pale light on her face in the dark. He could see by the way she was holding the phone and occasionally speaking into it that she was broadcasting live. By the time he got his coat on and came outside, there were already 3 neighbors on their porches in various states of half-dressed alertness, their own phones out watching. The snow was deep enough that he felt it go over the tops of his shoes cold, shocking his feet as he crossed the lawn. He did not run. He walked directly to the tow operator, a large man in a reflective vest who was already crouching to attach the chain to the front axle, and handed him the deed. Not a copy. The original with the county recorder's seal and his father's signature and the full legal description of the property. The operator read it with a flashlight in the falling snow, reading it slowly the way a careful man reads something he suspects might change his morning. Then he stood up and turned to look at Victoria across the street. "Ma'am," he said, "this is private property." The silence that followed was the kind that has weight. Victoria lowered her phone slightly. She said that she had authorization from the HOA. The operator said that the deed in his hand indicated the land was not HOA property, and that he was not prepared to risk his license over it. Victoria's voice rose, and the neighbors on their porches leaned slightly forward, and the snow kept falling impartial and thorough, covering everything equally. The operator got back in his truck and drove away. Ethan stood in his driveway in the dark snow on his shoulders, watching Victoria across the street as she continued filming, and he could see in her expression the first real crack. Not anger, not calculation, but something rawer and less controlled than either. He went in shh. 10 minutes later, his phone rang. It was Marcus. "I've been watching the feed," Marcus said without introduction. "Do not stop her anymore. Whatever she tries next, let her. Let her bury herself." Ethan made coffee and stood at the kitchen window watching the snow fill in the tire tracks the tow truck had left. The process server arrived on a Wednesday at 2 in the afternoon and rang the HOA management office bell with the specific neutrality of a man who delivered significant news for a living and had learned not to be interested in the reaction. The envelope he left contained the rent adjustment notice formally titled "Properly Notarized Citing Section 7.4, the Appraisal." The legal description of the land and the new annual figure $78,000 effective 90 days from the date of delivery. The notice was 3 pages long. The cover letter was 1 paragraph. Both were addressed to the Blackstone Ridge Homeowners Association. Attention, Victoria Hale, President. Ethan did not know exactly when Victoria read it, but he knew the approximate hour because that was when the neighborhood's informal communication network, the kind of thing that exists in every residential community, a web of texts and phone calls and conversations over back fences, began to hum with a frequency that suggested something significant had happened. By evening, flyers had appeared on every door in the development white paper, the HOA seal at the top, summoning all residents to a public lien hearing at the clubhouse the following Saturday to address in Victoria's language a malicious legal action being taken against the community by an outside party seeking to destabilize property values and threaten homeowner security. Ethan read one of the flyers standing at his front door in the cold, and then folded it and put it in his coat pocket. He went inside and called Marcus, who told him what to bring, and then he went to bed early and slept without difficulty, the way a man sleeps when he has done what he set out to do and is prepared for what comes next. Saturday morning he dressed carefully. Dark suit, the one he had worn to his father's funeral, white shirt, no tie. He put the envelope in his inside breast pocket. He drove to the clubhouse through a snowstorm that had been building since Thursday, the wipers working steadily. The road empty, the development quiet and white and still around him. The clubhouse was full. Every seat in the main room was taken, and people were standing along the walls and in the doorway to the kitchen, their coats still on their faces, carrying the collective expression of a community that had been told something threatening was happening, but had not yet been given the exact shape of the threat. The dais at the front of the room held Victoria and 4 board members, and Victoria looked exactly as she always looked, composed, precise, authoritative, except that her face under the fluorescent lights was perhaps 1 shade paler than usual, and she had touched her hair once since Ethan came in, which was not something she typically did. She opened the meeting by presenting the situation as she understood it, or as she wished it to be understood, an aggressive legal maneuver by a bad faith actor, a manufactured crisis designed to extort money from a well-established community. A situation the HOA was prepared to fight in court and would fight successfully. She said these things with great confidence and considerable fluency. Then she presented the foreclosure motion, the property on the north end, Dorothy Simmons's immediate neighbor, a house owned by a retired teacher named Franklin Ward, who had fallen behind on dues during a medical situation the previous spring. The motion passed 3-2, and there was a murmur in the room that was not approval. It was a man named Henry Dawson, retired, broad-shouldered, the kind of man who had worked outside all his life and carried it in his posture, who stood up from the 3rd row and said that the new landowner was in the room and ought to be given an opportunity to speak. Victoria said that the public comment period would come after the agenda items. Henry said that the agenda item currently under discussion was a foreclosure on land that the landowner in question had just served notice of reclaimed rights on, and that it might be relevant to hear what he had to say before the vote was finalized in the minutes. There was a long moment. Victoria looked at Henry. Henry looked back at her with the patience of a man who had been in the room long enough to have no particular fear of her. She said with the measured delivery of someone offering a concession they intend to make, appear voluntary. "Fine, Mr. Hale." Ethan buttoned his jacket and walked to the front of the room. He did not use the podium. He stood facing Victoria across the table, and he reached into his breast pocket and placed the envelope on the table in front of her. Not handed to her, placed, set down, slid forward with a deliberateness that was its own kind of statement. "Read it," he said. "Victoria." The room went very quiet. It was the kind of quiet that has texture, the hum of the heating system in the walls, the muffled sound of the wind and snow against the glass doors, the tiny creak of someone shifting their weight in a folding chair 3 rows back. Victoria looked at the envelope for a moment that stretched long enough to become its own event. Then she picked it up and opened it and read. He watched her read. He watched the pale settle deeper into her face, watched her hand tighten slightly on the paper, watched the moment she reached the number $78,000, and the moment she reached the paragraph that explained in language Marcus had crafted with surgical precision that any foreclosure action initiated by the HOA against a residential property within the boundaries of the ground lease area was legally subordinate to the landowner's rights, and that any such action taken after receipt of the rent adjustment notice would constitute a breach of the ground lease and could subject the HOA to liability. He let her finish. Then he addressed the room. He said it plainly without theater. The HOA did not own the land. It never had. Since 1992, the entire development, every house, every driveway, the clubhouse, they were standing in the park with Victoria's name on the gazebo plaque, had been built on land leased from his father. His father had kept that agreement faithfully for 31 years at a rate that had never been adjusted. He had inherited the land 6 weeks ago. The rent adjustment was legal documented and consistent with the terms of the original lease. Every foreclosure action the HOA had ever taken on this land was legally questionable at best and void at worst. And the HOA, whose leadership had known the nature of the ground lease since at least the tenure of the current board president, had never disclosed any of this to the residents who paid its fees and trusted it to act in their interests. He picked up his envelope from the table because he had made a copy for Victoria and did not need the original back. He said, "The foreclosure motion you just passed is void. A court will confirm that within the week." Then he walked out of the clubhouse into the snowstorm. Behind him, he heard it begin, not quite chaos, but the sound a room makes when a false structure comes down, that dissonant mix of voices rising and overlapping, someone asking a question loudly that no one was answering, a chair pushed back sharply. Victoria's voice attempting to reassert order and failing for perhaps the first time in 9 years to find its usual authority. The county courthouse was a building that communicated through the specific gravity of its stone facade and the ice that had formed on its front steps that it had been dealing with human disagreements for a very long time and expected to continue doing so. The sky that morning was the flat uniform gray of deep January, and the bare trees along the front walk held their snow in the precise, patient way of things that have learned to bear weight without complaint. Marcus had prepared the filing with the meticulous thoroughness that was apparently his natural mode, the deed, the original lease with all 50 pages, the appraisal report, the HOA treasury reports going back 9 years, with the ground lease payment line highlighted in each one, the tow truck footage from the second incident, which someone on a neighbor's porch had captured in full and sent to Marcus without being asked, and 16 signed affidavits from residents of Blackstone Ridge attesting to fines, liens, and in 2 cases foreclosure proceedings they believed to be excessive or unjust. Dorothy Simmons's affidavit was the last one in the stack. The HOA had retained outside legal counsel, a firm from Richmond that specialized in community association law, and had presumably been given a confident brief by Victoria about the strength of the HOA's position. That confidence eroded visibly in the courtroom as the morning progressed. Judge Eleanor Pierce was a woman of about 60 who read the documents that were placed before her with the quiet attention of someone for whom reading legal instruments was not a performance but a practice, and who asked questions with the economy of someone who needed the answer and not the explanation around it. The HOA's attorney, a man named Carver, who had come in with the bearing of someone accustomed to winning on procedural grounds, began the session with a motion to dismiss on the basis that the rent adjustment notice was a bad faith action designed to destabilize the community. Judge Pierce denied the motion in approximately 45 seconds and asked him to continue. He continued. Marcus presented the case in the order he had prepared, deed lease appraisal treasury records, then the affidavits. Each document was entered into the record without objection that the judge sustained. The Treasury records were the moment the HOA's attorney went quiet in the specific way that attorneys go quiet when they understand they have been given an indefensible position by their client. The record showed clearly and consistently 9 years of annual payments labeled ground lease payments signed off by the board president each quarter. The HOA had known, its leadership had known, and it had foreclosed on residents, fined residents, placed liens on residents' homes, all while sitting on a legal reality it had chosen not to disclose. Judge Pierce issued her ruling that afternoon from the bench, which was itself a signal of how much deliberation the facts required. The foreclosure proceedings initiated by the Blackstone Ridge HOA against properties within the ground lease area were void as they had been executed without authority over land the HOA did not own. All fines issued to residents that were subsequently liened and escalated to foreclosure action were subject to review and potential vacatur. The rent adjustment to $78,000 annually was lawful under the terms of the original ground lease, Section 7.4, and was binding on the HOA effective at the end of the 90-day notice period. The HOA's financial practices were referred to the county attorney's office for investigation. The HOA's attorney said nothing as the ruling was read. Victoria Hale was not in the courtroom. She had sent the attorney in her place, but Ethan found out later that she had been in the parking lot of the clubhouse at the moment the ruling came down, talking to a reporter from the local paper who had heard about the hearing and come out to cover it. By the time the article ran the following morning, the reporter had also obtained a copy of the Treasury reports and had written a story that was, by the standards of local journalism, devastating in its specificity. Henry Dawson called Ethan that evening and said, "I think the mountain finally decided it was done being quiet." "Bums," Ethan said, something like that. Henry laughed the short laugh of a man who has been waiting a long time for something and is still slightly surprised to have seen it happen. "Guess we finally know who owns the mountain," he said. The recall petition circulated within 2 weeks of the court ruling and collected signatures with the velocity of something that had been waiting for permission to exist. 41% of homeowners signed in the first 3 days. By the end of the second week, it was 68%, well above the threshold required under the HOA's own bylaws. The board meeting called to certify the results was the most attended in the community's history. People standing in the hallway, people waiting in the parking lot in the cold, children sitting on laps because no one had thought to arrange childcare, and no one wanted to miss it. Victoria Hale did not appear. She sent a letter read aloud by Raymond, the board member who had cast the dissenting vote on the Franklin Ward foreclosure, announcing her resignation from the board, effective immediately, citing what she described as a hostile and legally compromised environment. 2 other board members resigned the same day. Raymond, who had apparently been waiting for this for longer than anyone realized, accepted the chair on an interim basis and called for new elections within 60 days. The interim board's first official act was to commission an independent legal review of every fine lien and foreclosure action the HOA had initiated in the previous 9 years. Its second official act was to read the 1992 ground lease aloud at a community meeting, all 50 pages, with Raymond pausing after each section to explain in plain language what it meant so that every resident of Blackstone Ridge understood, perhaps for the first time, the actual legal ground on which their homes stood. It took 2 hours and 20 minutes. People stayed for all of it. When Raymond read Section 7.4, there was a moment of silence, and then someone in the back of the room laughed, not bitterly, but with the release of a person who has just been told the name of the thing that has been happening to them and finds against expectation that knowing the name makes it smaller. Outside the clubhouse windows, the snow was falling in the soft, unhurried way it falls when a storm has spent itself, and what remains is just weather. Someone had strung Christmas lights along the eaves of the building late, but the interim board had tabled the holiday decoration enforcement policy indefinitely, and the lights were visible through the glass, warm and slightly blurred by the snow, making the parking lot look almost welcoming. Ethan sat near the back of the room and listened to the whole 2 hours and 20 minutes without speaking. He had not planned to stay. He had told himself he would drop off a copy of some additional documents Marcus needed signed and leave, but he had taken a seat and he had stayed. And somewhere around page 30 of the lease, he had understood that he was staying because his father would have stayed, because his father had sat in rooms like this and believed that the specifics mattered, that the details of an agreement were not fine print to be managed, but the actual substance of a promise, and that promises deserved to be heard in full. Dorothy Simmons received a check from the HOA's insurance carrier in late February. The amount covered the legal fees she had paid, the savings she had liquidated to prevent the foreclosure, and a sum the attorney described as compensatory, which Dorothy described when she called Ethan to tell him as more than I expected and less than it cost me, which is probably as good as these things get. Franklin Ward's foreclosure was vacated by court order. 7 other residents received formal notifications that fines previously leaned against their properties had been reviewed and found to be either miscalculated or improperly assessed, and that the liens had been released. The HOA's new board elected in March 4 new members, and Raymond, retained as chair, made its first quarterly rent payment to Ethan at the new rate in April. $78,000 divided into quarterly installments paid on time, with a cover letter that Raymond had written himself. On plain paper, without the HOA seal acknowledging the history of the ground lease and committing to transparency going forward. Ethan had the check deposited. He did not celebrate it exactly. It was not a celebration kind of thing. It was a correction. The land had always been worth what it was worth. His father had simply asked less than its value, and that had been his choice to make, and Ethan had respected it for 31 years by not knowing about it. He thought about that sometimes, the 31 years his father had been a quiet and patient presence in a community that did not always treat him as though he belonged there, and the things his father had chosen not to say, and whether that silence had been wisdom or resignation or something in between. He did not have an answer. He suspected his father had not had one either, and had simply decided that some questions were less important than the life you built inside of them. He had told Marcus in the week after the courthouse ruling that he was not selling. Marcus had said nothing, which was his way of acknowledging that he had expected as much. Ethan had not fully understood his own reasoning until later, not until the spring, when the snow was gone and the grass was coming back, and he was sitting on the porch of his father's house with a cup of coffee, watching a group of children from the neighborhood use the lawn as a cut-through on their way somewhere, the way children always use whatever space is available if adults haven't told them not to. He did not tell them to stop. He watched them cross the lawn and disappear around the side of the house, and thought about his father building the back porch one summer, cutting every board himself the way he had measured twice and cut once and never seemed to be in a hurry about it, the way the porch was still perfectly level after 30 years and probably would be for 30 more. The violation stake was still inside. He had pulled it out of the frozen ground the morning after the courthouse ruling, not in anger. The anger, if it had ever been anger, had burned off somewhere around the second tow truck incident and left behind something cleaner and harder to name. He had carried it inside and leaned it against the wall behind the kitchen door, and it was still there. He had not put it in storage. He had not thrown it away. He had not hung it on the wall like a trophy, because it was not a trophy. It was a document, a record of a specific kind of arrogance, meeting a specific kind of consequence. And he thought it might be useful to have something like that where he could see it not often, but on the days when something in the world was making him impatient, when he was tempted to believe that the easiest path and the right path were the same thing. The winter that year ended slowly as winters do in the hill country, releasing its grip on the landscape by degrees, a week of cold, then a week of something almost warm, then a cold snap that lasted 3 days and fooled nobody, and then finally a morning in March when the temperature came up past 50 before noon and stayed there. The snow on the north-facing slope behind his father's house was the last to go, a thin rind of ice and packed white, retreating uphill over the course of 2 weeks until it was gone. The lawn, when it came back the way lawns do after a hard winter, slowly at first, then all at once the green returning in patches and then spreading until the whole yard was the same, even color it had been in October before the first freeze, before any of it. By April, the children were back. By May, the subdivision had the particular quality that residential communities have in the first real month of warmth screens going back in windows, lawn furniture being dragged out of garages, the sound of a mower somewhere in the late afternoon, the smell of someone's first cookout of the season drifting through the neighborhood. Ethan sat on the back porch his father had built and drank his coffee, and did not think about Victoria Hale, or the courthouse, or the violation stake behind the kitchen door. He thought about the land. 1,300 acres of it stretching in every direction around the development, some of it wooded, some of it the open hill country his grandfather had farmed, all of it his. Not by achievement, but by inheritance, which was its own kind of responsibility, the kind his father had understood instinctively and had never needed to explain because he had simply lived. It had simply treated the land as a thing that trusted you to be worthy of it and that would outlast you regardless. The land had always known who it belonged to. It had waited under 31 years of construction and fences and violation notices and tow trucks through one generation's hard work and another generation's absence through all of it, with the patience of something that does not experience time the way the people living on it do. It had simply been there. And eventually, because eventually is how these things work, the rest of them had figured it out. There were things he had not expected in the months after the ruling. He had expected the legal resolution to feel conclusive, and it did. But resolution, he discovered, is not the same as the absence of weight. The weight changed shape. What had been the weight of injustice in progress became the weight of history that could not be undone, only acknowledged. Dorothy Simmons had lost a winter to fear. Franklin Ward had spent 4 months believing his home was at risk. The family who had waited 14 months for a wheelchair ramp had waited those 14 months, and their grandmother had lived her last year without the accommodation she needed, and no court order could give that time back. Ethan understood that the limitation of the legal system was that it could correct the record and could make people whole in financial terms, but it could not touch the actual cost. The sleepless nights, the indignity of being told by an institution that your reasonable request was non-compliant, the quiet erosion of trust in the place where you lived. He thought about this often. He thought about it when Henry Dawson stopped by in March with a bottle of bourbon he said had been waiting in his cabinet for the right occasion, and they sat on the back porch in the cold and drank a modest amount of it and talked about the land the way men talk about things they are glad to understand better than they did before. Henry had lived in Blackstone Ridge for 22 years. He had moved in when his kids were young, had coached baseball at the community park, had watched the neighborhood change around him as the original residents aged, and new families moved in, had watched the HOA shift over the years from something that organized block parties and maintained the common areas into something that wrote letters about paint colors and sent security to photograph your driveway. He said he had always sensed that something was fundamentally wrong about the way the community operated, but had never been able to identify it precisely. Now he could. The thing about a bad system, Henry said, turning the glass in his hand, is that it's hard to see it clearly when you're inside it. You think the rules are the rules. You don't ask who made them or what they're protecting. Ethan said, "My father knew." Henry was quiet for a moment. "Your father was a patient man." It was not quite a question. He was, Ethan said. There was nothing else that needed to be added to that, and they let the silence after it stand. The hill behind the house was still white, the tree line dark against a gray sky, the kind of late winter afternoon that hasn't decided yet whether it belongs to the season that's ending or the one that hasn't arrived. Ethan refilled their glasses and looked out at the land. 1,300 acres. His grandfather had worked it. His father had protected it. He was still figuring out what it meant to be the third person in that line. What obligation inheritance carried beyond the legal kind. What it meant to be the custodian of something that would outlast him as certainly as it had outlasted the men who came before. He did not have a complete answer to that question. He suspected it was not the kind of question that yielded a complete answer, that the answer was, instead, something you built incrementally, the way his father had built the porch board by board, measured carefully, without rushing, with the understanding that what you built had to hold weight over time. He knew this much: he was not going to sell. He was not going to let the land be something managed at a distance, reduced to a check that arrived quarterly and a legal description in a file. His father had lived on this land for 31 years and had understood something about it that could not be fully expressed in the language of property law or market appraisal. Something about what it meant to be rooted in a place, to be answerable to it in the way that a person is answerable to any commitment they have made in full knowledge of what it costs. Ethan was learning that language slowly. He expected it would take time, the land he thought was patient enough.